You are hardwired for change. You, specifically. Every single day of your life is a negotiation with accelerating obsolescence. The phone in your pocket, the car you drive, the medical procedures that keep you alive. They are all temporary solutions to temporary problems, awaiting the next, slightly better solution. We take this for granted. We expect relentless, aggressive innovation. It is the core rhythm of civilization, perhaps the core rhythm of being human. If you told a person from 1950 that in 70 years we would carry a supercomputer that connects us instantly to every piece of information ever recorded, they would have been astonished, maybe terrified. If you told a person from the year 1000 AD that in 1000 years we would fly, communicate across oceans, and map the human genome, they would think you were a god or a lunatic. We look back at the sweep of history, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the information age, and we see a continuous, exhilarating acceleration. Progress is our default setting. Forward momentum is our history. But what if I told you there was a time, a horrifyingly long time, where our ancestors, people who were biologically indistinguishable from you and me, simply stopped? We are not talking about 1,000 years. We are not talking about 5,000. We are talking about an epoch, a colossal, silent stretch of history so vast it devours all of modern civilization several times over, where the human mind, the magnificent, restless, problem-solving engine we possess, went into neutral. This is the story of the Great Pause, the moment our species achieved the biological hardware necessary for profound genius and then stood still for 100,000 years. To understand this trauma, we have to travel back to Africa, the undisputed cradle of our species, somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. This is where modern humans, Homo sapiens, start to coalesce. Anatomically, these people were us. They stood tall. They had the cranial capacity for complex thought, the vocal apparatus for advanced language, and the manual dexterity to manipulate their environment. They were ready. The launch codes were in place. And yet, for generation after generation, spanning millennia, they lived in a state of technological stasis that should fundamentally terrify you. Look at the evidence. The only evidence that survives the crushing weight of time. The stones. The tools. For hundreds of thousands of years before the rise of Sapiens, our ancestors, like Homo erectus and various archaic humans, mastered the Herculean hand axe. It was a masterpiece of simplicity, a bifacial, teardrop-shaped rock that defined utility across 3 continents. It was the longest-running product line in history, reliable, efficient, and utterly unchanging for over 1,000,000 years. When modern humans emerged in the Middle Stone Age, MSA, they inherited and then refined this tradition into something new. The Levallois technique. The Levallois method is not primitive. In fact, it's brilliant. It requires abstract thought, planning, and precise geometry. Instead of simply banging 2 rocks together, the toolmaker first prepared the core rock, a specific, meticulously shaped nucleus, with careful strikes. Then, with one decisive blow, they could flake off a perfectly sized, razor-sharp tool, maximizing the utility of the material. It was an industrial leap forward, giving them control and standardization. This was the height of technology. This was our ancestors, proving they understood geometry, physics, and mass production. Now, here is the cosmic joke. They invented this superior standardized manufacturing process, and then they stopped innovating with it. They were brilliant, but they were boring. From roughly 200,000 years ago down to 80,000 or even 70,000 years ago, the cultural toolkit of anatomically modern humans across vast swathes of Africa remained remarkably, agonizingly consistent. You could take a stone point found in Ethiopia dating to 180,000 years ago and compare it to a point found in South Africa dating to 100,000 years ago, and they would be fundamentally identical. We, who now demand a new phone every 2 years, had ancestors who were content using the same design, the same single-purpose tool for 60,000 years. Imagine the conversation, 60,000 years is enough time for human knowledge to be lost and reinvented 100 times over. It's 2,400 generations passing the exact same piece of intellectual property down the line. Where are the specialized bone tools? Where are the intricate carvings? Where are the projectiles designed specifically for a specific prey? Where is the art? Where are the needles for tailored clothing needed to survive colder climates? They are absent. The archaeologists, looking at the strata layer by layer, see a flat line where they expected a trajectory. The evidence tells us that these people had the brains, they had the hardware. But the software, the cultural imperative to improve, to change, to express, seems to have been locked in a recurring loop. This isn't just about tools. This is about the fundamental state of the human mind. Was it a crisis of imagination? Did success breed complacency? Did the efficiency of the Levallois technique, the fact that it works so well for general survival, become a kind of cognitive prison? The moment you solve a problem efficiently, you lose the drive to solve it better. This is the horror of the great pause, the fear that comfort, stability, and reliable routine can suffocate the very spark of genius that defines us. We had achieved a state of intellectual potential far exceeding our actual cultural output. We were capable of calculus, but only utilizing basic arithmetic. We had the blueprint for civilization, but we were stuck in the lobby. The question that haunts us now is not why did they start moving and inventing again. That's the easy part. The question is, why did they stop? Why did the most adaptable, clever, and restless species on the planet spend a period longer than the entire lifespan of recorded history sitting on its biological hands? What terrifying, invisible pressure kept us uniform, dull, and perfectly static? And more pressingly, what happened that finally, violently, broke the cycle? What external force or sudden internal realization finally unleashed the floodgates of innovation and sent humanity rocketing toward the creation of tailored clothes, sophisticated hunting weapons, and eventually, the colonization of the entire globe? The answer, etched in layers of African sediment and shattered stone, reveals not a slow, gentle awakening, but a sudden, terrifying shift in the world. A moment of catastrophic instability that gave birth to both genius and unimaginable suffering. Let's anchor ourselves in the timeline of the dull. You have to understand that the stagnation we're talking about wasn't merely a lull, it was an epoch. For approximately 150,000 years, the defining technology of the human species remained essentially unchanged. Think about that. From the moment our ancestors, biologically identical to you and me, with the same brain capacity, the same vocal potential, the same nervous system, first rode across the African plains, they were using tools that would be instantly recognizable across millennia. We call this technological suite the Middle Stone Age, or Mode 3, and it is defined by the Levallois technique. Now, don't misunderstand. The Levallois technique wasn't simple. It wasn't just bashing rocks together. It required a deep understanding of physics, geometry, and stone mechanics. You had to prepare a core rock meticulously, like sculpting a rough dome, knowing exactly where to strike it with a hammerstone to detach one perfect, pre-shaped flake. The precision was astonishing. It allowed these humans to produce identical, standardized blades and points again and again. They were masters of repetition. But that is precisely the horror of the great pause, isn't it? That mastery was also a mental straitjacket. They had achieved the perfect, repeatable widget. And then they stopped asking, what if we made the widget better? We look at the archaeological record and see the physical evidence of people exactly like us, living in huge swaths of Africa, thriving, surviving, hunting, and communicating. But they were doing it on repeat. It's the evolutionary equivalent of running Windows XP for 150,000 years without ever installing a patch, much less developing a new operating system. It raises the fundamental, unnerving question that academics are still wrestling with. When did biological modernity, the moment we looked like us, actually translate into behavioral modernity? The moment we started acting like us. The evidence suggests that physical appearance won the race by a colossal margin. We were running on high-octane genetics, but remained stuck in cultural neutral. What are the defining characteristics of this long, terrifying silence? It's not just the standardized stone tools. Look at what is missing. Where are the complex projectile weapons? They had spears, yes, but they were hand thrust. We see almost no evidence of advanced ballistics, no bows and arrows, no spear throwers, atlatls, that dramatically increased killing range and safety. Where is the specialized clothing? We find evidence of hides being used, certainly, but we don't see the tiny crucial bone needles required to sew tailored, insulated garments. Tailoring is critical. It allows humans to survive truly extreme cold and move efficiently. These people were relying on simple draping. They were clothed for Africa, but not yet equipped to truly conquer the Arctic wastes. And most strikingly, where is the complex symbolic culture? Sure, we find sporadic pieces of etched ochre or perforated shells that suggest ornamentation or marking. Small, isolated flashes of genius. But we don't see the widespread, sustained, deeply interconnected artistic explosion that defines the modern mind. There were no cave paintings covering entire walls, no mass production of beads, no widely shared burial rituals that suggest abstract religious belief or complex cosmology. The message is clear. Survival was the goal, and when the Levallois kit was sufficient for survival, the drive to invent vanished. Why risk valuable flint and energy on a new design when the old one worked perfectly well for the task at hand? This was a stable world that favored conformity. The reward for genius was negligible. The penalty for failure was death. It took something truly catastrophic to disrupt that equilibrium. Around 75,000 years ago, that equilibrium didn't just wobble, it shattered. The most habitable parts of Africa, the coastal strips, the inland lakes, the great river systems, had allowed our ancestors to flourish and maintain widespread social networks, reinforcing the uniform Levallois tradition. But stability is an illusion the Earth occasionally enjoys destroying just to remind us who is boss. We enter what geologists call marine isotope stage 4, or MIS4. The world was plunging back into deep cold, and the effect on Africa was devastating drought. The lush landscapes our ancestors relied on began to shrivel and die. The rains failed. The great interior grasslands, the highways of early humanity, turned to dust and scrub. This wasn't a slow decline, it was a rapid, brutal, environmental restructuring. It happened within a human lifetime, forcing rapid contraction. Populations that had once spread hundreds of miles apart, maintaining contact and cultural exchange, were suddenly severed from one another by arid, impassable deserts. The uniform culture fractured. Geneticists and archaeologists agree. Human populations crashed. We entered a severe evolutionary bottleneck. We were pushed to the very brink of extinction, confined to tiny coastal or riverside refugia, pockets of remaining fertility, predominantly in southern Africa. We are talking about perhaps thousands of individuals left globally. You and I, every single person walking the earth today, are descended from this small, desperate cohort. The Levallois tradition, the great symbol of uniformity, was not built to handle this level of decentralized, high-pressure survival. It was a tool for a stable ecosystem where predictable prey followed predictable routes. Now, predictability was gone. When you are fighting for the last remaining mussels on a rapidly receding coastline or tracking the few surviving megafauna across bone-dry riverbeds, you don't need a perfectly standardized, aesthetically pleasing stone point. You need a tool that gives you a genuine lethal advantage over starvation, over rival groups, and over the increasingly desperate animals you hunt. You need specialized weaponry to kill from a distance, because getting close is too dangerous. You need tools to process tiny difficult foods like marine shellfish. You need clothing that keeps you warm during the newly severe global winters. In short, the environment stopped rewarding conformity and started demanding specialization. Nature, in its terrifying brilliance, had locked humanity in a starvation chamber, and the only way out was innovation. The comfortable, dull Middle Stone Age was over. The stage was set for the explosive birth of the modern mind, forged in trauma, desperation, and the violent realization that the old ways guaranteed death. We left off with a terrifying thought. The environment, suddenly and brutally, stopped accepting mediocrity. The comfortable, conforming mind that had defined the Middle Stone Age, the mind that spent 200,000 years making the same elegant, beautiful, but ultimately inefficient stone tool, was guaranteed to die. You see, for maybe 100,000 years, we were too good at being safe. We'd achieved a sustainable, stable, slightly dull equilibrium with nature. But now, climate change, driven by dramatic shifts in orbital cycles, had fractured the world. Ice caps expanded, sea levels dropped by massive amounts, sometimes 400 feet or more, and the once lush interior of Africa became a desert hellscape, a dust bowl that stretched farther than your mind can comfortably imagine. Where did the remaining people go? This is where the story gets acutely desperate and deeply human. We know from genetics, from tracing the mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, and from studying modern genetic diversity, that humanity went through a catastrophic bottleneck. The estimates vary, but the consensus is chilling. The global human population may have plummeted to as few as 10,000 breeding individuals, perhaps even lower, maybe just a few thousand families scattered across the entire continent. If you are watching this, you are a descendant of those few desperate souls who made it through. We all are. If you weren't lucky enough to be born near the coast, you died. Simple, direct, inevitable. The few places that offered a fragile lifeline, a refugium, as archaeologists call it, were those narrow coastal strips in southern Africa, places like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave. These places weren't paradise. They were the last gasp of survivability. What did they offer? Shellfish, mussels, limpets, oysters. Tiny, fiddly, difficult to gather food, but reliable when the land dried up and the great herds died off or retreated. Imagine being one of those people. You are looking at a coastline that is constantly shifting. The sheer panic of knowing that your primary food source, the ocean tide pools, is not stable, and that every decision you make regarding resources has zero margin for error. This isn't just about survival. This is about optimizing every single calorie gained and minimizing every single calorie spent. And this pressure, this terrible, crushing need for efficiency, is what finally cracked the shell of the Middle Stone Age mind. The first physical evidence of this cognitive revolution, the true explosion of the modern mind, isn't a complex piece of art, though that came soon after. It's an accounting ledger written in stone. It's the invention of the standardized blade. Before, in the Great Pause, the typical tool was the Levallois core, a good, serviceable stone chunk that yielded one or two decent flakes. Now suddenly, our ancestors started using the prepared core technique to produce slender, standardized blades. These blades were twice as long as they were wide, and they were struck off the core like wafers. Why does this matter to you and me? Because it's the birth of raw material economics. You take the same amount of stone, but you get 10 times the cutting edge. This means less time mining flint, less energy transporting heavy rock, and more specialized tools. This innovation isn't just a technical tweak, it's a cognitive shift. It requires planning 3 steps ahead. You must prepare the platform, strike at the perfect angle, and predict the exact shape the blade will take. It's the difference between guessing and engineering. The brain, under extreme duress, had finally learned how to maximize output and minimize risk. And once that mechanism, the specialization mechanism, was turned on, it didn't stop. It began to accelerate, fueled by the terrible urgency of survival. If the blade was the birth of efficiency, the next major leap was the invention of composite tools and the systematic use of bone. Think about stone. Stone is external. You pick it up, you smash it, you shape it. Bone is internal. To use bone, or antler, or ivory as a material, you have to understand its physical properties differently. You can't just smash it. you have to cut it, scrape it, grind it, polish it. That process takes time, patience, and a knowledge of structural mechanics far beyond simple flint knapping. In sites like Blombus Cave, starting around 70,000 years ago, we see the definitive shift. We find finely worked bone points, spear tips that are light, aerodynamic, and far more lethal than stone tips. More astonishingly, we find bone awls and eventually needles. Stop and think about the needle. It seems simple, right? But the invention of the needle is one of the most profound technological achievements in history because it means one thing: tailored clothing. Before the needle, you wrapped hides around your body. They were cumbersome, they allowed air in, and they were wildly inefficient at retaining heat. With the invention of the fine bone needle, you could now pierce hides and sinews and sew tightly fitted garments. Hoods, sleeves, boots, trousers, clothing that sealed you off from the environment. This wasn't vanity. This was the conquest of cold. It meant that those small groups trapped in the South African refugia now possessed the technology to survive the freezing winters and, critically, to eventually expand back into the brutally cold northern latitudes that had killed off their ancestors. The desperation of climate demanded we stop being naked apes huddled by a fire and start being engineers of our own thermal envelope. But there was one final, terrifying technological hurdle they had to clear before they could truly conquer the world. They needed to stop fighting starvation hand to hand. Until this period, hunting was a terrifying proposition. If you wanted to kill a large animal, a bison, an ancient deer, a mammoth, you had to get close. Too close. You had to jam a relatively heavy wooden or stone-tipped spear into its flesh, often requiring half a dozen men rushing a wounded, furious beast. The energy cost was astronomical, and the mortality rate for the hunters was constantly high. Every hunting trip risked your life and your family's caloric future. Innovation solved this too, and the solution wasn't better stone, but better mechanics. The invention of the projectile delivery system, the mechanism that allowed early humans to kill from a distance, was the ultimate insurance policy. Whether it was the spear thrower, the atlatl, which appeared slightly later in the archaeological record, or the sudden perfection of lightweight, detachable, barbed points designed to fly straight and true, the effect was the same. Risk was removed. Suddenly, you could stand 50 feet away and kill an animal with sufficient force to pierce hide and bone. You reduced the energy expenditure of the hunt, you increased the caloric return, and most importantly, you kept the hunters alive longer. We were no longer just surviving the climate crisis. We were preparing to monetize the new efficiency of our minds. The cognitive hardware was fixed, patched, and optimized. The population was small, resilient, and armed with technologies that guaranteed their dominance. The stage wasn't just set for survival, it was set for colonization. And when the climate finally, tentatively, started to warm up again, giving us the smallest window of opportunity to leave our coastal refuges, we were ready. We were about to take these devastating new inventions, the standardized blades, the bone tools, the lethal projectile weapons, and export them to the rest of the planet. And when we finally encountered the other human species that had been living in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, the gap in technology, planning, and resource management would prove to be an unbridgeable chasm. This wasn't a war fought by generals or defined by battle lines. This was a technological singularity meeting an ancient, highly specialized defense mechanism. You have to understand the sheer, brutal unfairness of the moment. We, Homo sapiens, emerged from the African coastal bottleneck refined and brutal, armed with solutions to problems the rest of the world hadn't even realized they had yet. We were lean, we were small, and we were logistics experts. Meanwhile, sitting in the frozen forests of Europe and Central Asia, you had the Neanderthals. Let's stop visualizing them as cavemen dragging clubs. They were incredibly strong, physically built like brick houses, designed to withstand bitter cold and wrestle down massive game. They were smart, too. They buried their dead, they cared for their injured, and they possessed the kind of deep, intuitive knowledge about their immediate environment that we, with our constant need to standardize everything, had long since lost. But their technology, their toolkit, was static. For 300,000 years, they relied almost exclusively on the Mousterian industry. Flakes of stone, carefully prepared, used primarily for cutting and scraping. Their hunting weapons were mostly heavy, handheld spears, thrusting weapons. This means that to kill a woolly rhino, an elk, or a bison, a Neanderthal hunter had to get close, dangerously close. Archaeologists confirm this grim reality by looking at their skeletons. Neanderthals had patterns of injury consistent with rodeo riders, broken ribs, broken arms, head trauma. Every successful hunt was an existential risk. Now, imagine us arriving. We didn't need to get close. Remember that standardized blade design we spent centuries perfecting during the climate crisis? We weren't just using it to butcher meat. We were using it as the tip of a spear. More critically, we had projectile weapons, specifically the atlatlae, the spear thrower. It's an extension of your arm, giving the spear incredible velocity and range. Think about that chasm for a second. The Neanderthal hunter has to sneak within 5 meters of a giant bison, risk being gored, and stab it with a thrusting spear. Our hunter, a lean, often smaller person, stands 20, maybe 30 meters away, throws a lightweight spear using an accelerator, and delivers a lethal blow before the prey even registers the threat. It's not just a difference in weaponry, it's a difference in risk management. We monetize safety. Every hunter we kept alive for longer meant more resources, more knowledge transfer, and critically, a higher birth rate. The Neanderthals were hyper-specialized survivors, efficient at the moment of the kill, but consistently losing men to the hunting process itself. We were generalized conquerors, prioritizing distance and logistics above brute force. So, as we begin to leak out of the Middle East and into the Eurasian landmass, it wasn't a sudden, apocalyptic war. It was slow-motion demographic suffocation. We didn't have to defeat them in battle every time. We just had to be 10% more efficient at resource extraction, 15% better at long-term food storage, and have 20% more children surviving to adulthood. We were wearing tailored fitted clothing stitched with bone needles, allowing us to venture further into the cold. We had nets and hooks, allowing us to exploit the reliable resources of rivers and oceans. We didn't rely solely on large, dangerous megafauna. The Neanderthals largely missed out on these specialized tools. They were the apex hunters of the deep forest, but when resources became scarce, their generalist neighbors, us, simply ate a wider variety of food and stayed warmer while doing it. This wave, this initial, unstoppable global expansion that began roughly 70,000 to 50,000 years ago was driven entirely by that cognitive hardware upgrade we experienced back in Africa. We carried that toolbox across deserts, through mountains, and across continents. We reached Australia 65,000 years ago, crossing treacherous seas, proving our capacity for planned, multi-stage journeys. We covered the distance that took previous hominids hundreds of thousands of years to cross in mere tens of thousands. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. They were absorbed into our gene pool in small amounts, pushed to the marginal fringes of Europe, and ultimately vanished. The planet was ours. This is the point where the story should peak. This is the moment where the victorious species, having demonstrated unparalleled cognitive flexibility and technological innovation under pressure, should accelerate. We conquered the world. We eliminated the competition. We survived the Ice Age. We should have immediately begun inventing agriculture, building cities, and launching rockets. But we didn't. We stopped. And this is the uncomfortable truth that historians and archaeologists still wrestle with. The explosive innovation that defined our survival, the creation of projectile weapons, standardized blades, and complex planning, suddenly plateaued. It didn't accelerate, it froze. We had won the evolutionary lottery. We were the sole remaining species of humans. We had the highest functioning brain in planetary history. Yet, we spent the next 30,000 years, an epoch longer than the entire recorded history that separates you and me from the pyramids, doing almost nothing new. We built an empire using tools invented by our great-great-great-grandparents who survived the climate collapse. We crossed continents with the same bone needles, the same specialized blades, the same spear thrower. The cognitive hardware was optimized, the world was conquered, and then the human mind seemed to hit the ultimate moment of intellectual repose. We achieved global dominance, and the engine of invention seized up. The great pause had begun. What does this tell us, you and I, about the human condition? That we are only truly innovative when the knife is at our throat? That comfort breeds intellectual decay? We had reached the maximum possible efficiency required by the environment. We were the undisputed apex predator, and the struggle was over. And when the struggle ended, so did the necessity of radical thought. For millennia, the toolkit stayed exactly the same. We were living proof that biological success can lead to cultural stagnation, a profound, frightening idea that has echoes even today, doesn't it? The real question isn't how we won the world, but why immediately after winning it. Did we collectively decide we were finished thinking? What was it about that newly conquered world that lulled the most advanced brain in history into such a dangerous complacency? And how long, exactly, did this terrifying intellectual silence last? We talk about millions of years of evolution, of slow, painful improvements, jagged steps forward and terrifying steps back. But if you and I were to look at the archaeological record, not through the filter of modern documentaries, but with the cold eyes of a historian, we would see something genuinely horrifying. A silence, an intellectual flatline that lasted longer than the entirety of civilization, longer than the pyramids, longer than agriculture. This wasn't a local issue. This was the collective mind of our species seizing up across entire continents. You have to understand what the stagnation actually looked like on the ground, in the dust, next to the fire pit. It wasn't that our ancestors couldn't figure out physics. It's that they found the perfect hammer and decided they didn't need a nail gun. They found the optimal balance between effort expended and calories gained. This principle, the bedrock of successful biology, optimal foraging efficiency, became the cultural coffin we lived in. Look at the tools. We are talking about the Middle Stone Age technology, the elegant simplicity of prepared core techniques. You, the craftsman, would meticulously shape a core stone, let's say a beautiful piece of chert or obsidian, so that you could strike it just right, shearing off a perfect razor-sharp flake. This flake became the multi-purpose tool, knife, scraper, piercer. It was the biological Swiss Army knife. It worked. It killed. It butchered. It guaranteed survival. Now, imagine finding the remnants of a campsite from 200,000 years ago. You dig up those flakes. Now imagine you find a site 50,000 years later, 3,000 miles away, maybe in what is now modern-day South Africa, or perhaps the Levant. You dig up those flakes, and what do you find? The same technology, the same striking platforms, the same angle of removal, the same basic shape. They didn't just share a common ancestry, they shared a common unyielding methodology. For generation after generation, spanning the entire lifespan of perhaps 7,000 individual human lives, the process was immutable. The apprentice learned from the master exactly how to strike the stone. To deviate from the learned technique was not seen as innovation, it was seen as failure. It was heresy against efficiency. We, standing here today, are obsessed with iteration, the constant improvement, the software update, the 2.0. But for our ancestors during the Great Pause, the ultimate achievement was perfection of reproduction. The goal was not to make a new tool, but to make the 1,000th tool exactly like the first, guaranteeing the same level of survival success. Think about the psychological toll of this enforced conservatism. The human brain, the magnificent machine capable of poetry, mathematics, and abstract philosophical thought, was constrained to solving a single, repetitive problem. How do I efficiently process the resources the environment has already granted me? It's the terrifying realization that intellectual freedom is often a byproduct of necessity. When necessity vanishes, the drive for freedom often follows suit. We had conquered the fire, the large game, the shelter. We had language and sophisticated social structures that allowed for cooperative hunting on a scale never before seen. We were anatomically and neurologically modern. If you put one of those early humans in a suit today, they could probably learn to fly a plane or code software, given enough time and education, of course. The hardware was ready, but culturally, they were trapped in the loop. The environment was stable enough, or crucially, our mastery over the environment was complete enough, that there was simply no selective pressure for a new design. Why bother figuring out how to haft a spear, attach a sharp point to a handle, when your perfected handheld flake works just fine against the current array of megafauna? Why invent a bow and arrow, a complex compound technology requiring tensile strength, precision joining, and abstract planning, when simply driving a herd off a cliff or ambushing them with perfected thrusting spears does the trick? The terrifying implication for us, looking back, is that biological dominance is not a guarantee of intellectual progress. Sometimes it's the opposite. It's a paralyzing blanket of complacency. Consider the time scale again. This technological freeze frame wasn't the length of a modern recession. It wasn't the duration of the Roman Empire. We are talking about the entire arc of Western history compressed into one small period of innovation, followed by an immense, silent, multimillennial plateau. We were living proof that you can possess the cognitive capacity for radical invention, and yet, collectively, choose to do nothing with it. We were waiting. But waiting for what? Waiting for the environment to shift so radically that the perfect tool suddenly became useless. Waiting for some internal cognitive trigger to fire off an entirely new way of seeing the world. The truth is, this stagnation, this great pause, was the longest sustained intellectual drought in human history. It's what happens when we stop being scared. And we had to be scared again, truly, existentially terrified, to finally break free from the perfect, sharp, and ultimately boring efficiency of the Stone Age. The shift wasn't a gentle transition. It was a sudden, explosive break, a cognitive, archaeological Big Bang. And when that happened, it didn't just change the tools, it changed the very nature of human existence. We need to understand what finally cracked the shell of this immense cultural rigidity. What was the catalyst? Because when the dam finally broke, what followed was an explosion of creativity so rapid, so dazzling, that it changed the very definition of what it meant to be human, and left the great pause in the dust of history. We've established the length of the pause, about 1.5 million years, defined by that unchanging, beautiful, yet ultimately cripplingly efficient teardrop shape of the Acheulean hand axe. But the true terror of the pause wasn't just the lack of new tools. It was the psychological inability to think of a new way to make them. We were trapped inside a cognitive box built entirely around subtraction. Think of our ancestors. They picked up a rock and chipped away everything that wasn't the desired tool. It was a direct, tangible, immediate process. If you want a hand axe, you remove the excess stone until the hand axe remains. Simple, effective, mind-numbingly rigid. To break the pause, they didn't need a stronger arm or a sharper piece of flint. They needed to execute one of the most abstract and difficult mental jumps in human history, the ability to manufacture a tool by preparing the waste product first. This is where the great pause ends and the world shatters into the explosive, terrifying innovation we call the Levallois technique. You see, for millions of years, the core, the large lump of stone you were shaping, was the prize. Everything chipped off was trash. But the Levallois method flips the entire equation on its head. Now, the core is no longer the goal. It is merely a complex, temporary template. Imagine this for a moment. You're holding a large, rough chunk of quartzite. You don't immediately start trying to chip off the final tool. No. First, you spend an hour meticulously preparing the entire circumference of the rock. You chip away small flakes, carefully shaping the surface of the core into what looks almost like the back of a tortoise shell. You're smoothing out ridges, creating precise angles, and establishing a striking platform at the top or bottom, all leading towards one specific, predetermined point. You are preparing the stone for one single, perfect strike. This required three-dimensional planning on a level that was, frankly, alien to earlier hominids. They had to visualize not just the finished tool, but the negative space, the precise angle of the force required, and the resulting fracture mechanics, all before the critical blow was even delivered. It is manufacturing by mental pre-visualization. It is predictive planning. It is genius and terrifyingly complex. We often forget the sheer pressure involved in this technique. An Acheulean hand axe could tolerate mistakes. You just kept chipping until it looked right. The Levallois technique is unforgiving. If your preparation strike angle is off by 2 degrees, if your platform is too weak, if your initial shaping isn't absolutely perfect, the resulting strike fails, and your hour of meticulous work yields nothing but shattered scrap. Think of the teaching required. Think of the trust needed by the apprentice. This wasn't trial and error. This was geometry and physics applied through bone and muscle. It represented a huge shift in cognitive load, demanding foresight, discipline, and a capacity for delayed gratification that archaeology simply hadn't seen demonstrated consistently before. This change signals a new level of self-awareness. To use Levallois is to admit that you can mentally manipulate reality before your hands touch it. It's the neurological shift from reactionary shaping, this rock is sharp enough, to strategic production. I need 10 identical, specialized points for the hunt tomorrow. And why did this happen after 1.5 million years of stasis? Because the world finally demanded that level of efficiency. The fossil record and climate science tell us the world was becoming volatile. Cycles of extreme cold and drought put intense pressure on hominid groups. The massive, beautiful hand axe, while robust, was terrible for portability and specialization. You can't easily haft a hand axe to a shaft. You couldn't afford to waste massive amounts of raw material. The Levallois technique, however, allowed our ancestors and Neanderthals, crucially, to produce standardized, razor-sharp flakes, perfect spear points, excellent scrapers for processing hides, and small, standardized knives. These tools were efficient, portable, and most importantly, replaceable. If you broke a Levallois point, you didn't spend a day manufacturing a new core. You pulled out a pre-prepared, lightweight blank and finished it quickly. This transition, the switch from massive, all-purpose tools to specialized, planned, and predictable tools, is the hallmark of the Middle Paleolithic, often referred to archaeologically as the Mousterian culture, especially in Europe. It wasn't just a technological advance, it was the emergence of systems thinking. But here is where the story gets brutal, because ending the pause did not usher in an era of peace. For over 1 million years, human evolution was defined by the cognitive difference between those who could make the hand axe and those who couldn't. It created simple hierarchies and clear advantages. Now, with the cognitive breakthrough of Levallois, that advantage was neutralized. Suddenly, both our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, emerging out of Africa, and the powerful established hominids of Eurasia, like the Neanderthals, possessed this terrifyingly efficient, modern tool-making technology. They were all armed with highly effective, specialized spear points and knives. The technological gap that had defined previous eras closed. The game board leveled. The pause ended, but the resulting explosion of mental capacity wasn't utilized for collective advancement. It was channeled directly into the most ruthless and intimate competition for survival our genus had ever known. We had achieved peak Stone Age efficiency, perfecting the art of prepared core technology. But that shared leap forward meant that wherever a Neanderthal hunting band ran into a Homo sapiens group, in the valleys of the Levant, on the plains of Central Asia, or in the caves of Europe, they were now meeting an intellectual and technological equal. The tools had changed, yes. The cognitive capacity had finally unlocked, yes. But the fundamental pressure cooker of survival hadn't just remained, it had intensified dramatically. The stage was set, not for collaboration, but for a global silent war where the only prize was existence itself. And while the technology was now equal, there had to be something else, a subtle, hidden difference that would ultimately decide which branch of humanity would inherit the earth, and which would simply vanish into the geological record. You see, the truth of this era, this great, crushing millennia of silence, isn't found in a revolutionary arrowhead or a new cave painting. It's found in the brutal, unforgiving math of survival. When you hit technological parity, when both sides can make a perfect levallois point, the war shifts entirely. It stops being about who is smarter and starts being about who is hungrier. We had to ask ourselves, as archaeologists and paleontologists looking back at the fossil record, if the minds were equal, if the tools were identical, then why did one group expand globally and the other fade into the shadows? The answer, ironically, lies not in advanced engineering, but in basic bioenergetics. Calories. Imagine the Ice Age European landscape. It's a magnificent, terrifying place. Giant fauna, mammoths, woolly rhino, a resource pool that looks infinite but demands incredible risk and coordination to tap into. Both Neanderthals and our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, were masters of this environment. They hunted the megafauna with a skill we can barely comprehend. But here is where the subtle, hidden difference, the one that would decide the fate of Earth's dominant species, began to emerge. Look at the bodies. You know the classic image of the Neanderthal. Powerful, robust, short limbs, barrel chest. It was a marvel of biological engineering, perfectly suited for conserving heat in cold climates. They were dense, muscular powerhouses, but that engine demanded fuel, a staggering amount of it. Based on fossil evidence and modern metabolic modeling, the average adult male Neanderthal needed an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, minimum, just to maintain that physique and withstand the unrelenting cold. Think about that number. That's the equivalent of a modern Olympic athlete training intensely. But the Neanderthal had to maintain that caloric intake every single day just to exist. Now look at us. Look at the ancestors of modern humans traversing the same landscape. Taller, leaner, gracile build, better suited for endurance running than pure powerlifting. Our required daily intake? Closer to 2,500 to 3,500 calories. A vast strategic difference. This difference wasn't about who could run faster in a sprint. It was about efficiency over geological time. It was about sustaining a population when the herd migration was thin, or when a volcanic winter darkened the skies for a season. When you're constantly fighting for territory, the side that can support marginally more individuals on the same resource base wins. It's a slow, grinding attrition. If 10,000 square miles of territory can support 100 Neanderthals or 150 Homo sapiens, guess who eventually fills the space? It's not a dramatic charge across a battlefield. It's a relentless demographic squeeze. And Sapiens had another trick up our sleeves, a difference rooted not in muscle mass, but in sheer adaptability, dietary breadth. While Neanderthal sites show an astonishing, almost singular focus on high-risk, high-reward, massive terrestrial game, we're talking 90% meat in their diet. Homo sapiens sites across the Levant and subsequently in Europe begin to show a radical shift. We started eating everything. We utilized coastal regions, extracting shellfish, fish, and marine mammals, resources that were stable and renewable and required completely different, less risky hunting strategies. We began to systematically process small, fast game-like birds and rabbits, which are low yield individually, but incredibly reliable collectively. Crucially, we got better at dealing with plants, tubers, and seeds, resources that require significant time and processing to unlock their nutrients, but which serve as the ultimate famine buffer. The Neanderthal diet was high quality, but brittle. It was magnificent when mammoths were plentiful, but devastating when they shifted routes. Our diet was lower risk, more varied, and therefore far more resilient. We were the generalists, thriving in the margins the specialists ignored. This flexibility allowed for one of the most critical advantages: larger social networks. A Neanderthal band, constrained by the need for massive daily calories, had to remain highly mobile and relatively small, perhaps 10 to 20 individuals. This size is wonderful for hunting synchronization, but terrible for surviving disaster. A flu, a hunting accident, a localized famine, and the entire lineage is wiped out. Our bands, fueled by a more stable, wider dietary base, could swell. We see evidence of larger gatherings, perhaps even hundreds of people coordinating during peak migrations. More people means greater genetic resilience, more opportunities for sharing specialized knowledge, how to make that specific poison, where the best flint is, and crucially, a deeper well of support. If you, a Homo sapiens hunter, break your leg, your large distributed clan, connected to other clans miles away through complex social rituals, can feed you until you heal. If you, a Neanderthal hunter, break your leg, your 15-person band must now feed you and maintain their impossible caloric quota while being one man short in the hunt. The odds immediately stack against you. This, then, is the crushing meaning of the Great Pause. Innovation stalled because every ounce of cognitive power, every waking thought, every social interaction wasn't channeled into abstract problem solving, but into immediate, critical efficiency. It was a life or death audit of existence itself. The question wasn't, how can we make a better spear? The question was, how do we ensure our family, our 50-strong collective, survives the next winter when the other guys are already occupying the best valleys? The final chapters of the silent global war took place over 20,000 years in the cold, unforgiving interface between our species. We weren't conquering them. We were simply out-surviving them. One birth, one death, one slightly more efficient calorie burned at a time. We were watching them shrink into isolated pockets, forced into marginal territories, clinging to existence while we continued our slow, inexorable demographic advance. The Ice Age was ending. The landscape was changing yet again. And for the Neanderthals, the changing climate was the final curtain call, revealing the ultimate, terrifying cost of specialization. But for us, the victors, the ones who inherited the Earth, the real existential crisis was only just beginning. Because while we had eliminated the competition, we had also established a dangerous, horrifying precedent that defines us even now. We had won by turning in on ourselves, perfecting the very system that had brought us to the brink. And we were about to find out exactly what happens when you're the last, lonely branch of humanity left standing. We stand at the precipice of the Holocene. The great, rattling, grinding machine of the Ice Age finally slows down, exhaling its last breath. The glaciers retreat, the sea levels rise, and the mammoth tundra fades into boreal forests and eventual grasslands. The world, the canvas upon which we played our terrible, brilliant drama, completely transforms. And here we are, alone. You and I, Homo sapiens, the inheritors. We didn't just win, we survived until everyone else lost. We are the last human branch standing, looking out over a globe stripped bare of its competition. The Neanderthals are gone, the Denisovans are gone. Homo erectus is a ghostly echo in the deep past. We are the only architects of stone tools left, the sole wielders of fire, the only ones burdened with this terrible, beautiful consciousness. And look at what we did next. If you expected that the moment we eliminated our evolutionary rivals, we would burst into an epoch of glorious, accelerating innovation, the moment when the blueprint for civilization was hastily drawn, you would be fundamentally wrong. You would be projecting our frantic, modern anxiety onto our stable, ancient ancestors. The truth is terrifyingly dull. We froze. We had spent 100,000 years under intense pressure. Pressure from climate. Pressure from megafauna, and most importantly, pressure from that brilliant, stubborn cousin species sharing the next valley. That interface, that constant need to be just slightly better, just slightly more flexible than the other guy, was the engine of our creativity. When the competition vanished, so did the immediate evolutionary necessity for radical, systemic change. We entered the Great Pause. For millennia, tens of thousands of years, an unimaginable stretch of time, we stopped innovating on a grand scale. Yes, locally, toolkits adapted perfectly to their immediate microenvironments. If you lived by the sea, your fishing tools became immaculate. If you lived in the deep forest, your specialized hunting points became lethally efficient. But the fundamental structure of the Upper Paleolithic mind, the way we organized ourselves, the pace of invention, the sharing of knowledge, locked down. We became masters of optimization, not exploration. Think about that for a moment. You just invented art, composite tools, tailored clothing, complex language, and intercontinental migration. You just proved you could outthink and outsurvive everyone else. And then you hit the brakes. Why? The consensus among archaeologists and evolutionary anthropologists is chillingly simple. We achieved equilibrium. We became so good at exploiting our specific local environments that the risk of radical innovation outweighed the reward. We didn't need to invent the wheel because our current system of hauling things, sledges, baskets, carrying them, worked well enough for the small population densities we maintained. We didn't need agriculture yet because hunting and gathering, coupled with our supreme knowledge of the local land, was a low-cost, high-return strategy. The invention of something truly new, something that demands a fundamental cognitive shift, something that requires discarding an established, successful method, is incredibly risky, especially when you are living on the edge of survival, which we always were. We traded existential competition for perfected inertia, and this is the horror that defines us. We saw it in the Neanderthals. Their specialization was their doom. But when we defeated them, we didn't learn the lesson of flexibility. We learned the lesson of success. Find a system that works and run it perfectly until the environment forces you to stop. We built cultural echo chambers of survival. If a new way of chipping flint appeared 500 miles away, it had almost no functional reason to diffuse across 500 miles of successful stable hunting bands already using their own locally perfected flint chipping method. Why change? Their method put meat on the table yesterday and will put meat on the table tomorrow. Change is for the desperate. And for 50,000 years post-Neanderthal, Homo sapiens was rarely desperate enough to throw the entire system out and start fresh. We were victims of our own success. We had perfected the local, insulating ourselves from the external pressure that drives evolution. The cost of being the last one standing, you see, is that you lose the mirror. You lose the external metric against which your success is measured. You lose the terrifying, necessary stress test that demands excellence and adaptability. We were no longer optimizing against another species. We were optimizing against the limitations of our own perfected internal systems. This pause, this slow, steady, quiet period of cultural stasis is perhaps the most dangerous moment in human history. Not because we were failing, but because we were succeeding too well. We were setting the precedent that defined humanity for the next 1,000 generations. We will perfect the bubble we are in, and we will resist change violently until a global crisis makes the cost of stasis higher than the cost of revolution. That crisis finally arrived, not in the form of a rival human, but in the relentless slow march of climate change and population growth. The end of the younger Dryas cold snap, the final retreat of the glaciers, the explosion of new plant life. This changed the world so fundamentally that our perfectly optimized hunter-gatherer existence started to fray at the edges. Local success was no longer guaranteed. It wasn't a flash of genius that ended the great pause. It was the crushing reality of demographics and diminishing returns. Suddenly, the old ways weren't putting enough meat on the table for the growing population. Suddenly, that huge risk, domesticating plants, inventing agriculture, settling down, became less risky than starving while clinging to the hunter's life. The Neolithic Revolution, the grand invention of farming, was not a choice. It was a surrender to necessity, a forced escape hatch from the dead end of perfected stasis. And so, we finally moved again. We started innovating again. We left the pause, but we never shed the underlying psychology. The lessons of the great pause echo into our time. We are masters of the local bubble. We perfect our technology, our politics, our systems of belief until we hit a wall. We don't change until we have to. We don't look outside our comfort zone until the ecosystem, the climate, the pandemic, or the geopolitical rival kicks the door down. We eliminated the need for external evolutionary pressure but we never eliminated the need for evolution itself. We won the war for survival 50,000 years ago, but we bought that victory at a tremendous cost: the tendency toward paralyzing self-satisfaction. We became the lonely, brilliant, arrogant species that is inherently prone to stagnation. We are the last branch left, and the terror isn't whether something else will emerge to challenge us, but whether we still possess the internal spark, the necessary desperation to challenge ourselves. We are still living in the shadow of that perfect pause, waiting for the next crisis to force us to evolve. The interface is gone. There is only us. And that is the most frightening truth of all.